Hello everybody and welcome to another Pathways RTC webinar, and this one is on engaging youth in organizations and systems, small steps to successful implementation. And we're just going to go over a couple of the how to use the GoToWebinar system. I think the most important aspect is just to make sure that your cell phones and other electronic devices are sort of far away from the computer, as they may cause some feedback and unpleasant audio. And also to have the webinar run more smoothly on your computer, you usually, it's recommended that you close all different file sharing applications like your Pandoras and your emails and things like that. It'll just make the webinar run smoother. We are going to have a Q&A session. It's going to be at the end, but feel free to use the chat box to put your question in the queue beforehand, or you will also be allowed to what's known as raise your hand at the end of the session, and that will be turned on when the presenters are finished. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Lacey Kendrick, and she is going to be leading the webinar today.
Okay, great. Thank you. As she said, I'm Lacey Kendrick Burke. I am the founder and executive director of Youth Engagement Solutions, and that is an organization that simply helps youth and adults partner to create positive change on more of a macro level within the organizations and systems that serve youth. My background is in psychology educationally. However, I experienced the foster care system for 6 years. And so I bring a lot of that expertise into the work that I do in helping organizations to develop more positive youth development focused practices and policies. And then, of course, my favorite part is being able to work with the youth and help them to develop the skills necessary to provide valuable information to the organizations that serve them. And then, so we'll go through and introduce all of the presenters. And then we'll give you an overview of the webinar and get into the meat of it. So, Matt.
Hi, my name is Matthew Hudson. I'm a 24-year-old third-year law student in Topeka, Kansas. And I grew up in Kansas child welfare system from the time I was 14 to 18. Currently, I'm a consultant for the National Resource Center for Youth Development out of Tulsa, and the Director of Operations for Youth Engagement Solutions, as Lacey described. And then I sat on Kansas's Youth Advisory Council for current and former foster youth for 6 years before I got too old.
And Clay.
And I am Clay Fink. I'm with the National Resource Center for Youth Development. I'm a program supervisor. And I've been with the Resource Center for just over 6 years and have about 21-year experience in child welfare in various aspects.
I'm Thomas Chapman. I'm a retired commissioner from the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services in Texas. Was one of my labors of love was starting the independent living, transitional living programs in Texas and working hard to develop youth involvement and youth input and to follow that when we got it. And I'm also now a consultant with the Resource Center for Youth Development and with Lacey's organization, Youth Engagement.
Okay, thanks, guys. Also, during the webinar right now, we have our techie people tweeting live. So if you want to follow us and join in the conversation, you can search for us on Facebook, the National Resource Center for Youth Development, or Youth Engagement Solutions LLC. And follow us on Twitter and join in. Follow Youth Engage SOL, it's up on the screen, or at NRCYD, and the hashtag is Youth Engagement. So we'd love to hear from you guys. Okay, so getting into the overview of the webinar, we're going to talk just very briefly about positive youth development and how that framework and philosophy fits in with making sure that youth are truly and effectively engaged in your organization or your system. And then there are three main areas of youth engagement. There's an individual and practice level, We are not going to discuss that on this webinar. There are, however, other webinars that the Pathways RTC has put on that go much deeper into that, especially in the transition process. And then we're going to mostly focus on the systems and administrative levels. So from a systems level, you can have just some examples of ways that youth can be effectively engaged, or through state youth advisory boards, through governors' councils, focus group meetings with state-level administrators, as Thomas will talk about later, and input into policy development groups. One example is with the program improvement plans with the CFSR. If you don't know what those are, Matt will talk about that in a little bit as well. And then from the organizational perspective, there are many ways that youth can be involved in that, and truly any level, youth can be involved at every level that exists within an organization in some capacity. So we're just going to talk about the various ways that we have seen that be effective in these organizations. And so through advisory groups or leadership groups, through youth can sit on board of directors. Several organizations make sure to have at least 2 youth on their board of directors to provide that youth voice in the direction for the organization. Youth serve as interns, employees, part of hiring panels for other staff members that are going to be working with youth. And that's proven, from what I've heard from people that have done that, that's proven very effective. And youth kind of have a sense about, who's going to work well with them and who's not. So, and then peer leaders and advocates. And so Clay's going to talk a lot about the organizational perspective of how they have successfully included youth. And then we're going to start out actually with Matt, who is going to provide the youth perspective on what it's like and what it's been like to be involved as a youth in some of these higher level administrative practices. So, Matt?
Hello again. Yeah, the first thing I guess I want to do is just go back and give a little more detail into what I was able to do or have been able to do with those 3 advisory boards or organizations that I've done work for. And what started was the Kansas Youth Advisory Council, the KYEC, is an advisory group here in Kansas for current and former foster youth. And I started working with them when I was in high school, actually, and when Clay, one of our other presenters, before he worked at the NRC, he was actually here in Kansas, and he was one of my advisors on this advisory council. And we were able to we would meet quarterly, and we would get things like work plans put together, which would allow us to come up with goals for the year of things that we wanted to either topics that we wanted to promote throughout the year, or meetings we wanted to go to have a panel to where whatever the audience was, be it social workers or judges, guardians ad litem, whatever audience could have a benefit of being able to ask us questions and allow us to share our experiences. And from that, we were able to get things like legislation, testify for legislation to get passed in Kansas, some of which I'll talk about a little later. And then it actually got so developed that now every year in January, when the KYEC gets together to put together their work plans, the Secretary of SRS and the Director of the Division of Children and Family Services come and they review them with us, and then they submit them for approval to to SRS. And so it's really gotten to be a very beneficial tool, not just for the KYC, but also for making sure that the work they're doing is getting out to as many people as possible. And from doing work with that organization is what led me to I ended up consulting with Clay for the National Research Center for Youth Development. And what I would do there is I would go around the country with Clay, training other states on how to get youth boards together and various other parts of youth development in terms of anything that kind of dealt with. We would have national conferences every year for foster youth around the country, and just anything where we could promote like positive activities and positive use of youth within their states, be it youth board or sometimes other things that were a little more informal. And then the work that Lacey and I have been doing with Youth Engagement Solutions is more of taking another step up in that systemic leveling, because it's trying to not just to reach out to the youth themselves, but to the organizations that can get in touch with them, so that, smaller, in-state organizations and things like that can utilize their own youth. And so those are some of the things that I've done and had experience with on the state and national level. And so moving on to the next slide is kind of where I want to branch out and talk, not necessarily about my experiences, but how I feel like engaging youth can be done more generally. And one thing I think that's really important is that one thing that I've heard a lot in my traveling is when I go to a state and they'll say something to the effect of like, we can't find or get in touch with our youth, and it always really surprises me because it's just kind of like, well, there's 5,000 of them. They can't be that hard to find. And I think that a lot of youth out there really want to, but there hasn't been a lot of incentive, or there isn't a lot of information out there about how they may be able to. But the value in it is that there has been lots of success in states where youth opinions have been gained and been able to be used. For instance, Kansas is one of the states that has had a lot of success on their CFSR, and we have a really high level of youth involvement, a lot because of the Kansas Youth Advisory Council, but we also have regional councils, and we just have a good base of support from social workers and adults and organizations throughout the state that even if it's not going through the KYC organization, they're just really good at trying to engage their youth in any way they can by asking them for opinions or finding youth to come on the panels or anywhere that they can just be talked to, because in some base level that's really all it may take in some instances. But also, again, going back to a more legislative way, Kansas, we passed the Foster Child Educational Assistance Act in 2007, which extended a full tuition waiver to foster youth in Kansas for any of the 6 region universities in the state of Kansas. And then also had a sunset bill removed and a cap on the amount of students per university, and it really had a large bump and increase for the amount of foster youth who graduate from high school and then go on to college. And most of the people who are involved in that would probably tell you that one of the biggest factors in terms of the legislators' comments and the momentum that this legislation had was the amount of youth that were behind it and willing to drive to Topeka to testify on behalf of it and things like that. In Maine, a few years earlier than when we did the tuition waiver, Maine enacted legislation that required mandatory sibling visits, and it's been a long time, but I want to say it was at least within 18 months, maybe a year, but at these periodic times where siblings had to have been allowed visits with each other. And I know at that time Maine had a really well-established youth committee as well that was founded behind that. And so, I mean, we can see these isolated areas where when youth have been utilized in a very strong way, success can be seen on a lot of levels. And actually, one of the very first things that KYC talked about when I started was getting high school credits for foster youth, some kind of unified to where if they move schools, they won't have to lose credits. And a bill just passed this last summer to start doing that, to just have foster youth only have to meet state minimum high school graduation requirements. And that, following that brings me to our polling question, if we'll go on to the next slide. And that is, for wherever you may be, what ways has your system or organization engaged youth? And when Lacey and I were coming up with this question, we really mean that can be in a lot of areas. So that could be with the youth advisory board like I've talked about, or hiring panels, or on task force that deal with policy development, or in legislative advocacy, or being involved with boards of directors for child welfare-based service providers or other systems, or even something just as simple as trying to hire them as interns or employees or staff in those child welfare organizations, or ways that their opinions can help regardless of what kind of structure it takes. And then even other, which we just gave because we don't think it should be limited to the things that we came up with, because you can be trying to engage the youth in your state or your area regardless of whether it's something that's already been formalized in like, say, a youth board or something like that.
Mm.
I'm not surprised that 62% of the people who polled had the Youth Advisory Board, because especially in the last 3 or 4 years, I think that's something that I know at the NRC we've really been trying to promote, but also that, you know, that's kind of been post a lot of these changes we've been able to see, so that's not surprising. But I really like the fact that 54% was interns, employees, and staff, because I think it's really important to make sure that if there's a way we can be offering, you know, like payment and work and other kind of good things that can bolster other independent living skills, is probably a good thing. And so to end, I guess this last slide I have is being better prepared to take advantage of what youth can do to improve our child welfare systems. In my personal opinion, I think that with legislation like NIDED that started last year, and the way independent living is moving, I think that getting youth's opinions and getting them involved, especially if they want to, is going to be a really big, almost like movement, or at least different way of thinking than maybe we've thought before in terms of what they can do. And I know that just in the last few years, the amount of youth consultants, even at the NRC, has grown almost exponentially. And one thing that we say a lot, and that Foster Club started a few years back, was nothing about us without us. And I think the idea is that if we're going to be making decisions that affect youth in care, if we're going to be making decisions that can potentially alter the life of youth in care, I think it's almost illogical not to ask the youth in care what they think about it. And then kind of to end is, I know that when I started, and Lacey could probably say the same thing, it was doing a lot of kind of on my own and general reimbursement, but you know, a lot of out-of-pocket expense. And when I would travel around, even to pay hotels, I would have to pay them up front and before I got reimbursed and things like that. And it is a burden. I think a lot of the youth that do help in states want to do it, so I don't think incentives are necessary. But it's nice when you can offer them something for the help that they're willing to give. But regardless, I think that's a nice thing that we should be trying to do. But I think there's enough youth out there that want to help and want to share their opinions that, you know, they'd even do it without it. And in general, I guess that pretty much sums up what I had to talk about. I'm still on the younger side. I'm the youngest presenter here at 24, but I think that there's a value in keeping things simple, and just asking, you know, the youth what they think about something can, you know, be better than we could imagine for how it can help us and you know, make the changes that we want to see.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matt. Next up is Thomas Chapman, and he's going to talk about the administrative from a systems perspective. And Matt also will be available for just a few more minutes to respond to what Thomas has to say, and then we'll jump to myself providing some youth perspective throughout the rest of the presentation. So, Thomas?
I don't know if I want to have to follow Matt. Well done, Matt. No surprise. Let's go ahead and go to the first slide. I think I said earlier on, I helped start the independent living program here in Texas in the 80s when the 4-year independent living program came about. I was fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time. And we immediately realized we wanted young people involved, and probably one of the first things that we did was, and let's go ahead and go to the next slide, I guess. One of the, well, we're going to let that one sit. I'm going to talk about something else a little bit before I go to that. But what I think most everybody in the country did, and that was to get young people to present on panels at conferences. So we started to have the young people talk about their experiences. And one of the things that was really a learning experience for me early on was we would get young people, and I would really impress upon staff that they needed to prepare the young people, get them together and let them know what kind of questions might happen, let them know they didn't have to answer a question if someone happened to be personal and they shouldn't have been, if their comfort level wasn't there. So we'd spend a lot of time preparing the young people, and it was not uncommon for the morning of the the presentation for half or more of the young people to not be able to make it or to be nervous and decide they don't want to do it. So we wound up going down to the local group home and asking some young people if they would come. And they were always, without a doubt, every time amazing. It was just so revealing and so heartwarming, and people felt like they learned so much about it. And so people would say, well, you handpicked those young people? And I said, yeah, we sure did. We got the people that were available this morning. And I think that you'll find the same thing. You probably already have. We're probably preaching to the choir here. One of the other things that Matt said that I had a little different experience maybe than Matt did, and that was getting young people involved. And I often looked for young people who were really excelling, the young people who were making it in spite of us and not because of us, I used to say. And I found that sometimes those young people really didn't want to be seen as part of the system, and they didn't want to publicly be seen because of some of the stigma that might be. And so it was not infrequent that young people who I felt like had a lot to contribute felt like they didn't want to do that, that wasn't part of what they were doing to take care of themselves. So that's something that we continue to challenge with. I suspect it's not near the way that it was, because I think we've done a lot better work with our young people to help them realize the value that they bring to the system, and we listen as opposed to having presented at a conference and then not do anything about it. One of the first things we did, and it sounds like this is really preaching to the choir, that most of you are already doing this anyway, but Statewide Youth Advisory Committee, we started with, we have 10 administrative regions that we did at the time, and we had each region have a youth advisory committee across Texas, and then each of those committees elected one person, and we flew them into Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, and American Airlines gave us a room, and we were able to just go right to the airport and meet. It was incredible, and they gave us food and everything. It was really a nice thing. So the young people and us, and we had a young person that coordinated it that I will talk about in a minute, but we came together and came up with a series of recommendations that they then presented to our board of directors that met monthly in Austin. And I'll tell you, there wasn't any recommendation that was made to that board. Many times it was vendors saying they needed to be paid more, we needed to relax restrictions. But when the young people talked, they listened. And in all the different roles I had in the department up to being commissioner, when one of those issues came up, it was frequent. I don't think a board meeting came up that one of the board members didn't say, the young people already told us about that, Thomas. What have we done about that? Have we, you said you have a plan about it. What's the progress on that? And if we didn't have a good answer, we were expected to come back to the next board meeting. And that was a much stronger board reaction than it was with anybody else that presented. Some of the things that they tackled, which were things that were very important to me, were psychotropic drugs, overuse of those, lack of contact or placement with siblings, just the whole quality of care issue for residential, driver's license, always a big deal, case planning, being involved in case planning. We had a real problem in Texas with following that, and one of the things that we learned was we took their recommendation immediately and implemented a policy that everyone had to be involved in their case planning. It was not uncommon for young people from Houston to be placed in Amarillo, and it wasn't likely that we were going to fly them all the way back to Houston to be involved in their case planning. So while we put a policy in place, we hadn't done a very good job of implementing it, and young people didn't necessarily want to fly back either and get taken out of school and the kind of things that causes. But those were the kind of things that they tackled. And one of the things that was a big deal for us, and that I still feel very strongly about, was in those kinds of jobs, when you're making the kind of decisions that we all make in these agencies and administrating them, it's often we choose between the right thing to do, and I don't think anybody would argue that it isn't the right thing to do to ask young people, and the thing that's going to, on the other side sometimes, the issue of whether or not it's going to promote what you want to do for the agency or what you want to go forward or help the agency politically or financially. In my opinion, and I think most everybody that worked with me in Texas would agree, it was the right thing, and it promoted what we wanted to do, and it helped us not only politically but financially. When the young people talked about the issues, they were much more likely to have them funded, whether that was before our board or that was before the legislature, who they testified before a lot. I still see one of the leading people. We passed our tuition fee waiver in 1986. I think we're the first in the country. Florida argues with me, but I think I'm right. And the legislator who did that was a very influential man that did a whole lot in Texas. He doesn't see me that he says, when people ask me what was the best thing or most important thing I ever did in the legislature, it was when we passed that bill. And he said, I still remember those two young men that you brought to the office, and we sat down and talked about it, and they testified before my committee. Let's go to the next slide. What were the lessons learned? Smartest thing we ever did? Never did it seem they were self-serving. In fact, many times they were young people like Matt who had already left care, and they would talk about, I know this isn't going to do me any good, but I'm worried about my brothers and my sisters, or my foster brothers and sisters. A lot of recommendations made it into policy, some successful in implementation, some not. And it came to pass that if a recommendation came from the Youth Advisory Committee, it had much more credibility than it came from, well, maybe not much more, but it certainly had at least the credibility that it did if it came from staff, and I think in most cases more. Next slide. Here's where we struggled, and it sounds like a number of you have done it, so this is probably preaching to the choir as well. We immediately had a young woman who surfaced who was speaking a lot at the conferences and things, and I just thought the world of her. She was strong, she was confident, she was just out of care. So we created a job and we hired her to work, and we wanted her to help with staff training, which she was already doing across the state, train other young people to help with staff training, review all of our policy from a youth perspective and give us feedback, speak at conferences, which she was already doing, and then provide consultation to foster parents and caregivers. She did all of those very well. Unfortunately, she was better prepared for us than we were for her. We put her in an environment that was very difficult, and we just hadn't, and I'll take personal responsibility, I think I had not foreseen the kind of support she was going to need, and I had a lot of other things going. Next slide. But the great things that happened were staff became much more aware of the issues from the youth perspective, because it just hadn't happened before in the early 80s or mid-80s. And what my big thing was, I'd be sitting in a conference and somebody would say something that a caseworker had done that hurt them or they felt like didn't promote what they wanted to do, and you'd see this pained look on about 10 people's face when it happened, because we all realized we just didn't have a clue that we'd done something that would hurt someone or not be to promote them. The young people felt like they had an advocate, and they became much more confident in advocating on their own behalf. And this young woman became the face of foster care in Texas, and so legislators and other people knew her, and it was no longer a number or someone that we just talked about foster care. And I will admit, we were very proud of ourselves. We thought that we had figured out we were walking the walk, and we did, but there were some things that we didn't do as well as we could. Next slide. We didn't define the job well enough. It was too vague. We said those things that were there. We injected a young person fresh out of care into a professional state office environment, and we expected her to fit in. Our staff went out of the way to make her fit in, but it still was very hard for her. It was much too self-directed. We didn't time limit the position. We talked about it, but I would probably recommend, and Matt may have a different opinion, or Lacey, they've certainly been in those positions, I think, but I think probably a couple of years so that you can move them on to the next thing and allow someone else to come in. Again, we should have been more specific, and that we would need to carve out much more time and support than we did to help that young person be successful. That said, it sounds like I'm saying it wasn't successful. It was one of the best things we did, and they're doing it now in Texas. They've got a number of staff, both in the regions and at the state office, doing a number of young people doing staff functions, and they're doing a lot better job of supervising and supporting them than I ever did. Next slide. What I would recommend in closing is just looking for any opportunity to interact with youth. When you visit local offices, if you're a statewide person and you're going out there, I didn't do this very often, but I did it some, and I would highly recommend it, is to arrange for just any time you go out to the regions to make those visits and promote your staff and make them feel like you understand what they're doing and listen to them. Also listen to the youth. And don't just say, what can we do better? Have a series of specific questions. You may be able to start with what can we do better, but that's a pretty big question sometimes if young people haven't had the opportunity to give their opinions. So be prepared to ask very specific questions where it will lead them and kind of break the ice and allow them to come forward. And I did not do this. I did it some and have continued to interact with a number of the young people I met during that time, but a practice of taking a young person to lunch regularly, spend some time with them. Not only do you get really good information, but more importantly than anything, you're being a role model to those other staff around you to understand that it's important to you that they listen to youth and that youth are important to the whole system in getting their input. And the return on all these kinds of things and the many things that probably you're doing that I've never even heard of are incredibly more than we ever invest in them. And that's the end of my part of the presentation.
Okay, so I wanted to jump in. Thank you so much for the first two speakers sharing. And before Matt has to leave, we did have one question that sort of was a more youth-focused question so far, and that's do changing generational characteristics, Gen Y, millennials, etc., do they shape recruitment and retention efforts, and if so, how? And I was just wondering, Matt, if you wanted to sort of speak to maybe how young people today might respond differently to different types of recruiting or the appeal of being on an advisory board or other youth efforts.
Yeah, I guess the answer to that one is kind of simple, yes and no. Because I think, yes, I think in terms of like generations and like the difference in like what we kind of call the youth culture now, I think it is different. But at the same time, youth wanting to be involved is something that in some ways doesn't change, especially with the stigma that's around it. And I don't know if the stigma has really changed, only there's so much more youth involvement now than there was before. That's changed. But in general, I don't think like the populace view has changed. So it's like everyone's trying, like we're trying, you know, and in like Senator Chafee, like Chafee legislation that came out in the late 90s, like stuff like that is changing, but that doesn't necessarily affect everything. And I guess part of this kind of goes to something that Thomas said, which was, you know, his statement that, you know, there's a lot of youth that don't want to participate, and that's actually true. And I guess what I meant when I said that there are youth who want to is that the ones who want to like really want to, like they want to not because they're going to get paid for something and not because you know, like they don't mind spending a Saturday afternoon even if they have to drive 3 hours to get there and 3 hours back to go to these things, because it's born out of that anger and spite that you were talking about. But once you get beyond that, you realize the benefit in what you're doing, and when you can get the kind of involvement like the lady you were talking about in Texas, Thomas, and then people like Lacey and myself, you start to see the intrinsic benefits in those things that motivate you only to do it more. And I think that showing youth those things, and that those things are possible, and that we don't have to be relegated to, you know, like, fine, we're done with high school, now get out of here, and, you know, you're done, go fend for yourself. Like, letting them know that there are options for them and that there are places to come back to and things that they can do. I don't know, I can't specifically answer what things you have to do to attract youth to want to be involved now as opposed to like in the 80s, because I was born in 1987. So I didn't have a lot of direct experience, I guess, with it. But I know that for me, you know, as a 16, 17-year-old in early 2000s, I wasn't, you know, really gung-ho about doing this, and I obviously couldn't foresee what it would do for me. but people just kept asking me. They just kept telling me, like, hey, come here and do this. Hey, come here and do that. You want to come do this? We'll send someone to get you. We'll drive you up. You know, there'll be food, you know, and stuff like that. And it was just like they kept asking and kept asking and kept asking. And while at first I may not have been very motivated, ultimately I did, and I was. And like I said, it took some of that, like seeing what could happen and the benefit of what we were doing to be able to like really change my attitude. But I think that there's more people out there that would be amiable to that than we may think. Like, I think there's lots of them. I was in Arizona in June to moderate a panel at a judicial conference, and there were 4 former foster youth there. One who was starting med school in the fall, another one who was a probation officer, and then 2 others that were a little bit younger. And they were all just fired up to be there and share their experiences, and they weren't getting, I got paid. I don't know how that works. I got paid, they didn't. And they were the ones doing all the work, and I find that to be more common than uncommon in things that I do, that the youth who want to be at these places are there, and that there are these people out there who want to help, and most of the time it's because they're probably on the other end of that spite and kind of hatred for the system and how they may have grown up and stuff like that. Does that answer the question?
I think so. And one other one that was actually directed to you, Matt, is what do you think are the most effective incentives for getting youth involved? So either sharing like what your incentives were, or sort of what you think. We keep talking about incentives being important, but what would adequate incentives be?
I think it depends on what you're doing, how much time it takes the youth. I think if you want youth to come and you can't get them transportation, you have to be willing to, I think that we should be willing to reimburse them. We should be willing to do everything for them to get them somewhere as we would want for ourselves. And that's regardless, like right now, when people pay me or want me to come out and do something, I haven't done anything in years and years and years and years where there wasn't some kind of reimbursement involved. And I feel like, wouldn't that be the same way for anything that we would do? You know, if I just picked a person out of this webinar, I was like, hey, I want you to travel 60 miles away, will you just go do that for nothing? You'd probably be like, no. And so maybe it's something as simple as reimbursement if it's something that doesn't take up a lot of time. If it's, you know, being on a board and going and staying 2 nights away at an overnight youth conference, then maybe it should be a little more, you know, something along the lines of even if it's just like a lottery for gifts or guaranteed gift cards or some other kind of financial incentive. I just think it's got to be something that they'll feel like the time they're putting in is worth it. I suppose it's hard for me to be really specific because there's like so many different situations and things they could be doing. But the more time it takes, the more they should, the larger the incentive should be. Not because it should take that much more to entice them, but because what we're asking them to do, we should let them know that it's valuable to us. Because the message we should be giving is that what you're doing is important to us, and we want to repay you for that. And that adds value to them for what they're doing. So I think that's the attitude that we should look. If you're trying to come up with an incentive, I think that's the attitude you should be coming up with it with. You know, that what do I feel like this youth doing for me is worth? Or you go and just ask them too, I suppose. So again, a probably lackluster generalized answer, but yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And so I guess we should probably continue with the presentation and then save the rest of the questions for the end. Lacey?
Okay, thank you. One of the things I did want to note that Thomas mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later when we get into the culture, but he mentioned, you know, being a role model, and that's not only for youth, but for your organization. And so if you can kind of pick up and take the lead in that, especially for high-level administrators or executive directors of organizations, it's kind of up to you to set the tone for your organization. So just keep that in mind as we go into the organizational level perspective that Clay Fink is going to talk about.
Okay, and yes, I am Clay Fink, and I am with the National Resource Center for Youth Development, as I said. If you'll move to the next slide, we are, the National Resource Center is a service of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Children's Bureau. We're a member of the Children's Bureau's network of training and technical assistance providers located in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we have a 5-year competitive award. Next slide. This is our federal project officer and our staff, and the only reason I have this up is because I like to plug our staff, but I also want to say that this is not where it stops. We have a whole cadre of young people that support the work that we do, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got there. So if we can go to the next slide. We are one of over 30 centers or agencies within the Children's Bureau TNTA network. There are 9 National Resource Centers, 5 Child Welfare Implementation Centers, Quality Improvement Centers, and other organizations, as you can see here. What we all have in common is that we work with states, tribes, and territories in the systematic improvement of child welfare services, and our overall mission is to improve the lives of children and families by providing the appropriate and meaningful training or technical assistance. What we have discovered is, at the Resource Center, we were walking, as Thomas kind of mentioned, we were talking the talk for a long time, and then we decided that we really needed to be role modeling and walking the walk. So truly it was about 5.5 years ago where we decided that we kind of put our foot down and said, when we go out and do training and technical assistance, we really need to have a young person whose expertise is in their foster care experience go along with us to back us up, keep us honest, and really show that youth perspective. So that's what we started. And so like I said, we have a cadre of young people that do that. Our ideal thing is that we have started to work with some of the other resource centers to have them also take out young people as co-trainers or co-facilitators in the training and technical assistance or the conferences that they hold as well. If you go to the next slide. Yep. Some of the programs that we look at are the CHAPI program, the Education and Training Voucher Program, Fostering Connections, and the National Youth and Transition Database. These are all areas that we try to move states and tribes forward on, and one of the things, and with Fostering Connections, we're getting more and more involved with that. Our work is also, and this goes into the next slide, is guided by 4 core principles of permanent connections, collaboration, cultural competence, and youth development. With the areas and these 4 core principles, this is how we work with the youth that we're involved with and try to role model that into the states through the training and technical assistance we provide. One of the areas, and probably the most, or the biggest way that we are doing that, and if you go to the next slide, is with what we have recently, through various versions, recently have come to develop is our young adult training and technical assistance network. The Young Adult Training and Technical Assistance Network, if you go to the next slide, is actually, we are getting ready to do our second phase where we are going to have about 200 youth across the nation who are either currently in foster care or alumni of the foster care system. They are coming from, this is a collaboration we do with Foster Club, but they are coming from the Foster Club All-Stars. They're the former NRCYD interns. They are leaders that we are finding out in youth advisory boards and work that we're doing in states. They are 100 outstanding young leaders and that are presented every year, as well as our former, we did a pilot version of the Young Adult TNTA network called the Young Adult Network. All of these youth combined come into this virtual network that we have where we do monthly webinars to discuss issues and topics that are related to the foster care system. Those calls are led by our network members along with a topic expert. So a professional from the field and the young person lead, and then there's a big discussion regarding these topics. And really the purpose is twofold. One is to orient the members to some of the issues and discuss, kind of come to a common ground. But the second piece is to really push the knowledge of not only our staff at the Resource Center and Foster Club, but also some of the consultants, adult consultants and professional consultants that we work with. But this Young Adult TNTA Network, then they are prepared to provide training and technical assistance to states and tribes. So as this group, most of the work is done virtually through social network sites, Facebook, etc. We do see some that kind of rise to the top, and then with a little bit of additional training, these are the young consultants that we are taking out with us to do the work in states and with the tribe. If you can move to the next slide. Some of the work that they do, like I said, a lot of the work is virtual, but they respond to polling questions. They review documents and policy and practice for various programs. They provide youth perspective, help us with our development of curricula. Obviously, as we said, they go out and do, some go out and do training and technical assistance with us. Some are providing presentations at conferences and convenings. So they're really trying to increase that youth voice in all aspects of the work that we do. Next slide. The work that we do is also done in what we have 3 different layers of training and technical assistance. And the Tier 3 level is more intensive work, and that's training and technical assistance that's done right with the state. So a state requests services or training in their state, and we are the ones that help provide that. Ideally, what we do, a lot of times the conversations, and some of those have changed a little bit, but when we would get a call from a state, most of the time it was about bringing a youth that they saw, whether it be a Foster Club All-Star or if it was Matt and Lacey who was working as our consultant. It was bringing those youth to help train people in their state. And what we've started doing, we would flip that conversation and talk about, let us work with the youth in your state to get them to the speed where they are able to assist in the training and technical assistance in your state. And that's twofold. One is they know the issues in your state. They know what's going on. They can keep you honest on the work that you do. And we've had that a lot of times where states were able to kind of disassociate a little bit in the fact that they could say, well, those are issues that this young person is having, but they're not from our state. Those are the issues that they may have seen in Kansas or Missouri or wherever we brought them from. But when it's actually the youth from your state that's raising the issues, that's kind of hard to argue. You really have to look at those issues and develop resolution around that. The second area is more targeted needs, and this is when we're actually looking at convenings and conferences where there's peers. The involvement that we have with youth there is, even though it's our Pathways Conference, which is our professional conference, when the call for presenters go out, we try to look for presenters that are also going to have a youth co-presenter or a youth facilitator. So a lot of times it's the youth voice in either through the work we do or in co-presenting or co-training that those targeted needs are met. And then the Tier 1 is more of our universal needs. That is our stuff that we put out on our website, in our toolkit. There's a wider base of information. And youth are involved in that. We engage those youth through the process of they help develop some of the toolkits. They help review the work. We've kind of coined the term euthanize, which doesn't mean to kill, but it means to give that youth perspective and that youth voice into the work. So through that, the work that we've done with our interns and our consultants and the YADA network, we've taken the work for policy practices, toolkits, whatnot, and sent it out to them that they're able to review and, as we said, euthanize that work and make it in youth-friendly terms. But that's done on a more universal approach with the work. So next slide. I think some of this is just a review of what I've said, but the work that we do, we facilitate the work with the Fostering Connections. We've reviewed CHAPI and ETV policies. We recommend ways to maximize resources and improve outcomes for older youth. Pretty much with the Resource Center, anything that has to do with older youth transitioning from care, we can be part of. That we facilitate stakeholder discussions and planning. Next slide. That we truly emphasize the importance of permanency for older youth. As I said earlier, that was one of the core principles that we use as a guideline. We create and implement positive youth development strategies. One of the things we always find is when we're in discussions with states, tribes, or territories, and we start talking about positive youth development, everybody has the idea that they're working in a positive youth development framework. And a lot of times they are, but maybe not to the extent that they could be. So we really try to push that envelope of how they're working with youth. We develop and strengthen youth leadership groups through youth board work, through youth-adult partnerships. We improve life skills assessments and how youth are involved in taking those assessments, and the fact of what happens afterwards. That assessment is not something that's just done, put in the file, but that it actually is looked at, and that the youth is driving not only the assessment piece, but how their instruction to those youth life skills are done. We strengthen the transition planning process, and hopefully that we can get youth to be in the driver's seat of those transition plans. And then we also support LGBT youth as well. Next slide. Overall, our goal is to build capacity in states, tribes, and territories to provide high quality of services through youth. And the way we look at that is we can do that as long as youth are involved. Youth truly are the experts in their, I was going to say the field, but in foster care. They have lived it. In what we say most time is that this is our job, but it is their life, and they've experienced it and can push that. I think my next slide is just about lessons learned. Oh, incorporating youth in NRCYD. What we have done is in the last 5 years, actually almost 6 years now, and you can go to the other ones as well. We've incorporated our youth through the consultants, the interns, the YADANet, and employees. As Matt indicated, he was one of the first consultants that we started working with. Him and Lacey came on board, and we were utilizing those two to go out and do work with us and be the co-trainers. From that, we've developed the internship program. We just finished our 5th year of interns. And then, as I said, the YADANet has been formed, and we're moving along with that. Since that time, we've also had almost 3 years now. YD itself has hired former foster youth as employees. Our agency, the National Resource Center for Youth Services, has more than that, but we're on our 3rd former foster youth as employees. And what we find, and I think my next slide is about lessons learned, one of the things we find is that through those consultants and interns and employees, the work that we do is pushed even further than what we could expect. We are far more productive. The work is more pertinent and time relevant. We have some of the lessons learned. I would like to say that, we're the National Resource Center. We knew everything about it going into it, but that'd be a big fat lie. We have learned so much, and I don't have even time or space to list everything that we did learn. Some of the things that Matt and Thomas have talked about are things that we learned as well. I think that when we first started, we were so excited, and we were just talking about this a little bit. We were so excited the fact that we were having former foster youth working with us as co-trainers that as soon as we got out there, we were announcing that. Little to our knowledge, what we were doing was outing them and kind of taking away that their expertise and the fact that suddenly they were looked at as just foster youth rather than being able to talk about the topic area, give their expertise, give their knowledge, and then talk about them being their experience of being a former foster youth when they were ready. I think some of the other key things are we actually have some toolkits on our website that you can access and look at around various things, but one of them is engaging youth. And I think some of the things we need to look at is don't underestimate the ability. There's a lot of people that we talked about early along that was talking about our youth weren't to the level of the Foster Club All-Stars or to the level of our consultants. And when we get in and start working with some of those youth board members and young adults within the state, we have found that they truly are capable and ready. With that, I'm going to leave my list of lessons learned and move on to Lacey. I know we're running short on time, so I want Lacey to go ahead and talk about her piece real quick. So Lacey, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Clay. So moving forward quickly, some of the things to keep in mind, I know you all are super excited about running out there and getting youth involved in every part of your organization that you can, but keep in mind as you go forward with the work that you're already doing out there and the work that you want to start doing is that one key thing is to make sure to prepare youth, not only professionally but emotionally. So that being said, Thomas spoke a little bit about being prepared professionally as adults to receive in youth that have experienced care. They're also still 18 or 19 or 24, and so there are a lot of things that I personally and I know other youth that have joined the professional world have to learn as far as professionals go, just as every one of you guys did when you entered the professional field. However, there's an additional component of making sure that youth are emotionally prepared for this work, because what we do is put our life and our experiences and our trauma that we've experienced, and we open that up to all of you guys out there doing this work so that we can make the system better. There was one thing that somebody had mentioned earlier about incentives, and yes, the financial incentives and things, as someone said, help us to do this more often. However, that's not the main reason that we get involved. And of course, speaking from a youth perspective, knowing that I'm going to make the system better because I'm opening up my personal emotional story, that's why I do it. But it's so super important to make sure that you work with youth, preparing them emotionally. That's something that as professionals we don't always keep in mind. Provide the youth with information for what meeting they're going to. You wouldn't expect an adult to show up at a meeting not knowing what the meeting is for, just knowing that they're there to be involved, not having any, knowing what their role is in the meeting. So that's all stuff to make sure to discuss prior to the meeting. And then, again, talking about providing travel stipends for transportation and food in a way that youth can access it ahead of time. So if you give them a check, make sure that they can go to the bank to cash it so that I don't know how many times I have, when I was younger and even as a staff person, have experienced, not having money to eat. And so I would, find ways and learn some resourceful skills, but it definitely would have been easier had I had some adults that had thought of that beforehand. So again, lessons learned. You can help your youth with that now. Also key to preparing youth, but then equally important is the debriefing session with the youth after the meeting. Again, this goes back to the incentives, but also professional and emotional development for the youth. So as a youth, having been in those situations, needing to process new things that came up emotionally when I was sharing my story so that I could give that information to the administrators or to the directors to make the system better. You definitely need to be able to process that out with somebody afterwards, and it may be a counselor, but it may be just a trusted adult that the youth identifies with. I know in my 2 years as a staff person at the National Resource Center for Youth Development, Clay was incredibly patient and answered tons of questions that I had, both about professional situations but also emotional situations, and that's where all of the key learning takes place, is in the debrief session. Next slide. So how can you guys take all of this information and what we've done and the key learnings and move forward with areas where you want youth to be more involved. So first of all, you need to know where youth are involved already. And one of the key things to do this, adults may think we've got youth on panels and boards and showing up and speaking at engagements. However, it requires you to ask the youth to see if they feel that they are involved and that they are being heard as well. So it takes both sides in partnership. And then taking a kind of a bird's eye view of your system or organization, looking at all the components from the top to the bottom, whether it be high-level administrative meetings and advisory boards or training entry-level workers when they first come in. There is a component at every level to engage youth in those. I know we're running low on time, so one of the other things that I want to talk about is just make sure to connect with other people that have done this kind of stuff before, and if you can learn from their lessons learned, then you're going to be about 50 steps ahead. So that's something that we can certainly put you in contact with, either the Pathways Research and Training Center. I know NRCYD has a listserv, Youth Engagement Solutions has a website and a Facebook page and Twitter, and we can get you in touch if you have any questions about any of this going forward. Let's see. Next slide. And so a lot of times implementation is, you think about the larger policies and guidelines that you have to develop in order to incorporate youth engagement throughout your organization. And yes, that's one key component. However, one of the things that I have found that just because it's in policy doesn't necessarily mean it's in practice. And so being able to engage your workers from, your frontline, your supervisors, your administrators, it takes everyone. And so one of the terms that I've kind of come into contact with recently is the term Kaizen, which is a Japanese word for continuous improvement. And so they really implemented this with Toyota, their organization over there, and a lot of businesses have caught on to this. But if everybody in the organization can commit to making one or two small changes in the way that they do things, then you're going to have a much larger change overall than if you just try to implement from the top down. So again, youth need to be involved in this. So maybe a worker can say, you know what, I'm going to ask every single day one of my youth what their opinion is about X, Y, or Z. And so that's a very small change, but in the larger organization, if everybody can commit to that, that's going to make a huge difference in the way that the culture is in your organization or your system. We'll go ahead and skip over those, but then another key component to making sure that your organization is moving in the right direction is the CQI and evaluation process. And that's something that is in development right now nationally with system of care, with child welfare, but it's definitely hot right now. So if you guys are interested, definitely hit us up. If you could go to the next slide. And the next slide. Yes. So here is our information. We would love to talk more with any of you guys about this. I know we didn't really have time for a lot of questions to discuss at the end here. But again, I wanted to say that we did this webinar in partnership with the National Resource Center for Youth Development and Pathways RTC, and bringing both the mental health and the child welfare system together because we're working with a lot of the same youth. And so if we can get them engaged in the different organizations and bridge those gaps between the systems, then we can more effectively engage youth across the board. So hopefully, I hope that you guys all got some good examples about ways that you can involve youth or more effectively involve youth. And we look forward to hearing from you and sharing our resources. So, Chris?
Thank you so much, Lacey, and the rest of the presentation team. This will conclude the webinar. Thank you for hanging on a little late. This webinar will be available on the Pathways RTC website, and also you'll be getting an email since you registered for this webinar alerting you to the fact that this will be online. And so you can get information and the contact information from all the panelists and get questions answered that way. Thanks again, and we hope you tune into another Pathways webinar. Good day.